The United States government shutdowns are among the most visible signs of political gridlock in Washington. When the Senate votes to end a shutdown, it isn't only an act of restoring government operations but also a reflection of deep negotiations, power struggles, and compromises that define American democracy. To understand why these shutdowns occur and why the Senate ultimately votes to end them, one has to look back at decades of political confrontations, constitutional interpretations, and fiscal disputes that have shaped this recurring crisis in American politics. The concept of a government shutdown is relatively modern. Before the late 20th century, the federal government never truly shut down, even during funding gaps. Departments and agencies continued to operate under the assumption that Congress would eventually pass appropriations bills. That changed in 1980 when Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti issued legal opinions based on the Anti-Deficiency Act, declaring that government agencies could not spend money or obligate funds without congressional authorization. From that moment on, the modern era of shutdowns began. The first official shutdown took place in 1981 during the Reagan administration. It lasted only a day and stemmed from disagreements over domestic spending. Since then, shutdowns have become political weapons used by both parties to force policy concessions. The reason the Senate often becomes the focal point in ending shutdowns is because of its constitutional role. While the House of Representatives initiates spending bills, the Senate's bipartisan structure and procedural rules make it the place where compromises are brokered. Senators, who represent entire states and often serve 6-year terms, are generally more inclined to seek negotiated settlements compared to House members facing more immediate electoral pressure. One of the most notable early shutdowns occurred in 1990 under President George H.W. Bush. The issue was over DEFIC. The pattern of shutdowns has repeated over decades. They have left deep marks on American political culture. Each episode becomes a mirror reflecting how far partisanship has grown and how fragile consensus can be in a system built on checks and balances. When the Senate finally votes to end a shutdown, that moment often feels like a restoration of reason, a quiet acknowledgement that the machinery of democracy still turns despite the noise. Yet beneath every resolution lies a larger question: why does the richest democracy in the world continue to flirt with self-inflicted paralysis? The answer lies in the intersection of ideology, media influence, electoral incentives, and the evolving nature of governance itself. Shutdowns thrive in moments when political identity outweighs institutional duty. Over time, lawmakers have learned that confrontation can energize their supporters, generate fundraising, and define their brand. But the Senate's culture, shaped by longer terms and statewide constituencies, forces a broader perspective. Senators must consider farmers, federal employees, urban businesses, and military families all at once. That diversity compels moderation. When shutdowns drag on, senators begin hearing from hospital administrators waiting on Medicare reimbursements, defense contractors losing revenue, and families unable to visit national parks. Those calls cut across partisan lines, pushing senators to cooperate. Ending a shutdown thus becomes less about ideology and more about restoring normal life for millions of people. The public response to shutdowns has also evolved. In earlier decades, citizens viewed them as temporary disputes. Now, with social media amplifying every delay and hardship, shutdowns quickly become national crises. Images of unpaid federal workers, empty museums, and blocked paychecks spread online within hours. The Senate, sensitive to that outrage, cannot ignore the optics. Each day of inaction chips away at institutional legitimacy. The Senate's decision to end a shutdown often comes after long nights of negotiations, private meetings, and mounting public frustration. Behind the scenes, senators from both parties work through competing drafts of continuing resolutions, short-term funding bills designed to reopen the government while broader budget talks continue. These measures rarely solve the underlying disagreements but serve as temporary bridges to restore functionality. What drives the Senate toward these decisions is not only economic urgency but also the fear of political blame. Polling data almost always shows that the public despises shutdowns, and the blame usually falls on whoever is perceived to be more rigid or extreme. Senators understand this dynamic well. Unlike House members who often represent safe districts shaped by partisan gerrymandering, senators must appeal to statewide electorates that include independents and moderates. That makes them more sensitive to public opinion, especially during a shutdown when essential services halt and media coverage turns relentless. To grasp how shutdowns evolved into recurring crises, it's important to look at the constitutional and procedural foundations of U.S. budgeting. The U.S. Constitution grants Congress the power of the purse, meaning it controls federal spending through appropriations bills. The President, however, holds veto power and the authority to execute laws. When the two branches clash over priorities, particularly in divided government, funding bills can stall. The Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits agencies from operating without congressional appropriations. This legal boundary transforms political disagreement into administrative paralysis. Prior to 1980, budget delays did not result in full shutdowns. Agencies continued under the assumption of future appropriations. Civiletti's legal opinions under the Carter administration changed that interpretation, creating the framework for what we now know as shutdowns. Through th. Historically, each shutdown has taught Washington a lesson, though the memory often fades before the next confrontation. The 1995-96 shutdown taught that the public punishes perceived extremism. The 2013 shutdown showed that ideological purity movements, however passionate, cannot sustain prolonged government paralysis without backlash. The 2018-19 episode revealed the limits of executive brinkmanship. In every case, the Senate's action to end the crisis reasserted its role as the stabilizing force within the federal system. Senators of both parties understand that they represent not factions but entire states. This structural reality, equal representation for Wyoming and California alike, pushes them towards solutions that, while imperfect, at least restore order. Shutdowns also shape how future negotiations unfold. After each one, Congress often passes temporary rules to prevent immediate recurrence. These include automatic spending caps, sequester mechanisms, or short-term continuing resolutions. Yet these fixes rarely address the root cause, deep philosophical divisions over the size and role of government. Democrats generally push for expanded social programs and safety nets, while Republicans emphasize fiscal restraint and limited spending. These visions collide during every budget cycle. The Senate, standing at the crossroads of those ideologies, becomes the mediator of last resort. When the chamber votes to end a shutdown, it symbolizes that even profound disagreement must yield to the basic function of governance. From a constitutional perspective, the recurring shutdowns underscore the tension between separation of powers and political accountability. The framers designed a system resistant to sudden change, assuming cooperation would prevail through compromise. What they could not foresee was the rise of permanent campaigning, where governing decisions are filtered through electoral calculation. Senators still face this reality, but the structure,